It was supposed to be a short flight, just under an hour, a quick hop from Miami to Atlanta. But minutes after takeoff, something began to burn deep beneath the floor, and no one knew. Not the passengers, not the crew, not the people watching from radar screens. What started in silence became one of the fastest and most terrifying air disasters in modern history. ValuJet Flight 592 was in the air for less than 10 minutes, and by the time the pilots understood what was happening, it was already too late. Welcome back to True Scary Air Disaster Stories, where we look into the real events behind the crashes that still echo today. In this episode, we are going into the fire. The kind of fire that does not give second chances. A fire that was loaded by mistake, packed under the floor, labeled as safe, and forgotten, until it reached up through the cabin and took everyone with it. This is the story of ValuJet Flight 592. So before we begin, how are you feeling today? I hope you are safe, and I hope the people checking your bags know exactly what they are loading. Because sometimes one label, one box, one overlooked rule is all it takes to burn everything down. It was May 11th, 1996, a Saturday afternoon in Miami. Passengers were boarding ValuJet Flight 592, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 operated by a low-cost carrier that had grown fast in the 90s. The flight was headed to Atlanta with a short stop just 1 hour in the air. On board were 105 passengers and 5 crew members. The crew included Captain Candlin Kubek and First Officer Richard Hazen, both experienced, both respected. The weather was clear. The runway was dry. There were no delays. Nothing unusual, except one thing. Down in the cargo hold, workers had loaded 5 boxes marked as aircraft parts. The boxes were sealed and taped. No one looked inside. They were not labeled hazardous, but inside those boxes were oxygen generators, chemical canisters that produce oxygen through a heat reaction, used in the passenger masks on planes. But here they were spent units removed after use, meant to be disposed of. Someone had packed them anyway. The generators were supposed to be empty, but they were not. And worse, they were sealed with safety caps removed, allowing them to activate if shaken or jostled. Each one capable of burning at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. As the plane taxied to the runway, those canisters sat beneath the floor of the cabin just feet below the passengers. At 2:04 p.m., Flight 592 took off from Miami. The climb was smooth. The radio check-ins were normal. For the first few minutes, it was just another afternoon in the air. But 3 minutes after takeoff, something started to change. In the cargo hold, one of the canisters ignited. The fire began as a chemical reaction, slow, quiet, but hot. It did not need a spark, just movement, just air, just time, and it had all 3. Within seconds, other canisters ignited. Flames spread across cardboard and wiring. Smoke filled the space beneath the floor. The heat climbed fast. It burned through insulation, through cables, through the skin of the aircraft. 4 minutes into the flight, a popping noise was heard on the cockpit voice recorder. The first sound of a system breaking. Then came the smoke. First Officer Hazen radioed air traffic control. "We need to return to Miami," he said. "We have an emergency." The controller cleared them for a turn. They began descending, but the fire was already out of control. Systems began to fail. Cables melted. Hydraulic lines burned through. The cabin filled with smoke. Passengers began coughing, screaming. The flight attendant tried to reach the cockpit, but communication was lost. Then came the final words from the cockpit. "We're losing everything. We're on fire." At 2:13 p.m., just 11 minutes after takeoff, the plane disappeared from radar. Witnesses on the ground saw black smoke and a fireball diving toward the swamp. The aircraft struck the Everglades at high speed. It disintegrated on impact. There were no survivors. Recovery teams were delayed by the location. The crash site was deep in the wetlands, surrounded by water, mud, and wildlife. The debris field was small. The plane had hit almost vertically. What they found was devastating. The passengers had no time, no chance. The heat had destroyed everything. Nothing recognizable remained. Investigators found melted wiring, scorched insulation, and the remains of the oxygen generators. The labels were still readable. The canisters had come from another aircraft collected as waste, but they were loaded anyway without safety caps, without warning labels, in violation of federal rules. The person who packed them thought they were safe. The person who loaded them followed instructions. No one knew what was really inside, and so the fire was packed like luggage hidden under the feet of every person on that plane. 11 minutes. That was all it took. A fire that no one saw, a system that failed in silence, and a tragedy that was already burning before the wheels left the ground. The recovery efforts were brutal. The crash site was in the heart of the Florida Everglades, a place where airboats were the only way in and where the land sank beneath every step. The plane had struck the swamp at high speed, nose first, leaving almost nothing intact. Wreckage was embedded deep in mud and water. Human remains were scattered, fragmented, and burned. It took weeks to recover what little could be found. There were no bodies to identify, only parts. For families waiting at the airport, the news came slowly in pieces. There would be no survivors. There would be no last messages. There would be nothing to bring home. As recovery teams fought the mud and the heat, investigators began to piece together what had gone wrong. They examined the flight data recorders, they interviewed airport staff, and they focused on one part of the plane, the cargo hold. Early reports suggested that fire had started below the cabin, not in the engines or wings. That meant whatever happened had been loaded before the plane left the ground. Soon, the truth began to surface. Maintenance workers at a nearby hangar had been collecting old oxygen generators. These were chemical devices, not tanks of air, but units that create oxygen through heat and chemical reaction. They are used to supply air during emergencies. After use, they become hazardous waste. They must be depressurized, labeled, and disposed of with care. But these were not. The units had been removed from another aircraft and boxed up. Someone had wrapped them in tape, labeled them as spare parts, and sent them to be transported by ValuJet. The people loading the boxes never opened them. They followed the paperwork. They did not know that inside were devices that could ignite just by being bumped or tilted. Worse, the safety caps had been removed. That meant the firing pins were exposed. All it took was motion. The cargo handlers loaded the boxes onto Flight 592 beneath the passenger cabin. No one checked. No one questioned. No one was told what the boxes really were. The moment the plane took off, the clock started ticking. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a full investigation. They uncovered gaps in communication training and regulation. Companies contracted to handle hazardous materials had failed to follow federal laws. The oversight systems in place had allowed mislabeled cargo to pass through unchecked. ValuJet, the airline, had grown quickly in the 90s. It offered cheap tickets, simple service, fast turnaround. It outsourced many operations, including maintenance and cargo handling, but growth had outpaced control. Safety had taken a back seat to cost. When the final report was released, it was clear. The cause of the crash was a fire started by improperly stored oxygen generators. But the deeper cause was human. The people who packed the canisters, the people who wrote the paperwork, the people who did not speak up, the people who trusted the process more than they trusted their own questions. This was not a system that failed. This was a system that was never complete. The fire was loaded in Miami, But the real match had been lit long before. The crash of Flight 592 shocked the country, not just because of how fast it happened, but because of how avoidable it was. The fire was not caused by a mechanical failure. It was packed by hand, carried on board without anyone knowing, and that truth hit harder than the explosion ever could. In the days after the crash, ValuJet grounded multiple aircraft. Inspections were launched. Reporters camped outside the company's headquarters. The airline stock dropped. Families of the victims began demanding answers. They wanted to know who packed the boxes, who signed the forms, who looked away. At first, ValuJet defended its procedures. It said the cargo had been managed by a subcontractor. It said the airline had no idea what was really in the hold. But the public was not satisfied, because ValuJet's logo was still painted on the wreckage, and every family on that flight had trusted the name printed on their ticket. The media coverage turned intense. Photos of the victims were placed next to headlines about cut corners, failed inspections, and missing regulations. Investigators revealed that ValuJet had been warned months earlier about safety risks. The airline had suffered multiple incidents: emergency landings, cabin smoke, landing gear failures. But it had kept flying because there was money to make and because no one had stopped it. The FAA faced harsh criticism. People asked how a plane carrying hazardous cargo could pass through inspection, how paperwork could hide something so deadly, how no one noticed that boxes labeled as spare parts were actually fire waiting to happen. Congress held hearings. Aviation experts testified. New rules were proposed. And all the while, the families waited. There were no funerals with caskets, only memorials, only names engraved in stone, only flowers left at the edge of the swamp. For them, the hearings were not about politics. They were about the sound of voices that were never heard again. In one interview, a mother who lost her son said he was afraid of flying, but I told him, "It's just an hour. You'll be home before dinner." She never forgave herself, even though she had no reason to, because none of the passengers could have known that something under their feet had already started to burn, that they had already passed the point of no return before they ever left the runway. In time, ValuJet was forced to suspend operations. It merged with another airline. It changed its name, but the memory remained, and so did the lesson. Aviation is built on rules, but those rules mean nothing if no one follows them. A form is only as strong as the truth behind it. A checklist is only useful if someone checks. The fire on Flight 592 did not break the rules. It slipped through them, and that is what made it so deadly. Years passed, but the fire stayed. Not in the wreckage, which was long buried. Not in the headlines, which faded as the next story came along. It stayed in the people left behind. The ones who never saw their loved ones again. The ones who watched them walk into an airport and never come out. Some of them never flew again. Some became activists. Some just waited, quietly, holding the weight that no one else could carry. The FAA rewrote its rules. Airlines were told to review all cargo procedures. Hazardous materials were reclassified. Oxygen generators were banned from commercial flights unless packed to exact standards. Inspections became tighter. Training became mandatory. And still, the lesson did not settle in facts. It settled in silence. Because Flight 592 was not about broken parts or failing engines. It was about people. About what happens when no one asks the next question. When no one lifts the box. When no one says, "Are you sure this is safe?" That kind of silence kills. And that kind of silence had been all over this flight. In the warehouse where the boxes were packed. In the paperwork signed without reading. In the ramp crew that trusted the labels. In the airline that trusted its contractors. No one screamed. And because of that, no one stopped it. Today, every airline follows stricter cargo rules. Every package is tracked. Every label is reviewed. But that did not happen because the system worked. It happened because it failed. Publicly, painfully, and with no second chance. Some stories end with warning lights. This one didn't. It ended with smoke that no one could see, with heat that moved faster than any checklist, with a fire that was already in the air before the cabin doors ever closed. That is what makes Flight 592 different. Not how fast it happened, but how long it had been waiting. The people on that plane were not careless. They were not unlucky. They were failed. By strangers they never met. By rules that were never enforced. By silence that was never broken. And when the fire came, it came for all of them. Equally, quietly, without mercy. The crash did not begin with fire. It began with paperwork, with routine, with names signed next to boxes unchecked. The more investigators looked, the more they found moments where someone could have stopped it. The oxygen generators were known to be dangerous. Other airlines had refused to ship them. ValuJet did not even know they were on board. The subcontractor who packed the canisters said he believed they were safe. He had packed them before. He had shipped them before. No one had told him to stop. And that was the problem. In every link of the chain, someone trusted that the last person had done their part. No one wanted to be the one to slow things down, to ask questions, to push back, because in a system built on speed and cost, doubt is expensive. But in this case, the cost of silence was higher than anyone imagined. The man who had taped the boxes later gave a statement. He said he was sorry. He said he would carry the weight forever. But he was not alone. The truth is, no one acted with malice. No one wanted anyone to get hurt. But the fire did not care about intentions. It cared about reality, about heat, about pressure, about chemical reactions set in motion long before the plane ever left the ground. And that is what made it so terrifying. It was not a dramatic failure. It was a slow collapse of vigilance. The FAA took responsibility. They admitted the oversight. They changed the rules. But even they could not promise it would never happen again. Because human systems are fragile. They depend on choices made by people who are tired, distracted under pressure. And that is why memory matters. Why training matters. Why culture matters. One technician, one box, one missing label. That is all it took. Today when you fly, your bags are screened, scanned, logged. Cargo is separated. Materials are tagged and cross-checked. But it took the lives of 110 people to get there. That is the cost no one likes to talk about. The cost behind the checklist. The price of a shortcut no one noticed until it exploded into the sky. The Everglades hold no monument. There's no towering sculpture, no marble stone. Just the water, the trees, and the names. The people who sat down on that flight thinking it was just another afternoon in the air. They were mothers, fathers, children, workers. They had plans, appointments, birthdays. And they were gone before any of those things arrived. In aviation, we are taught to trust the system, to believe that safety is built in. But Flight 592 showed something else. It showed that systems are only as strong as the people who uphold them. That fire can live inside a sealed box. That danger can sit quietly under your feet. And that the worst kind of failure is the one we all saw coming but never named. The world did not forget this flight, but memory fades if not protected. And so every airline that flies today, every technician who packs a container, every crew member who reads a cargo manifest, carries part of this story. They carry it so that others do not have to. So that no passenger ever boards a flight with a secret burning just below the floor. Some crashes leave behind wreckage. This one left behind a lesson. A lesson packed in a cardboard box taped shut and pushed into the belly of a plane. It was not hidden by evil. It was hidden by routine. ValuJet Flight 592 did not fall from the sky because of chance. It fell because no one stopped to ask what they were really carrying. It fell because everyone followed the line, but no one broke the silence. And in that silence, fire was free to rise. The passengers never knew. They never saw the smoke. They never felt the warning. It moved faster than thought, faster than fear, and by the time they knew, it was already over. But we know now, that labels matter, that rules matter, that checking again, even when it feels redundant, can mean everything. Because the most dangerous threat is not the one that surprises you. It is the one you let pass by, quiet, unopened, untouched, until it takes everything.